Hello and welcome. Right now we're standing in the homeland of the Sukoki Abenaki tribe. Today, there's a busy highway to the left of us. There's a parking lot up ahead where you parked your car, and maybe you packed a picnic to take with you to enjoy as you hike through the woods today. In fact, I hope you did. Perhaps you picked this site to go hiking without knowing anything about it. You're here by coincidence, or perhaps you picked it because you have heard of its tumultuous and controversial history. What I would like to do is tell you a little bit more about that tumultuous and controversial history. So what we're looking at here is a Massachusetts historical marker. The marker reads 1630 to 1930 Indian Council fires. 250 yards eastward are the sites of 3 large Indian Council fires. The Beers Massacre of September 4th, 1675 took place in a gorge 1/4 mile to the northeast. So what does this sign really tell us about the significance of this site? Not much. I'll tell you what it means to me. When I hear Indian Council fires, I picture a group of Native Americans attempting to meet in order to form peace between multiple groups. And when I hear massacre, I think of a violent war with people being murdered. And so what I'm thinking is that this site's tumultuous and controversial history has to do with the European settlement that took place during that time. So between 1630 and 1930, a lot of things happened in this country, but specifically during the 1600s, we know that Europeans were settling here very rapidly. They were coming all of the time. They were filling up the land. There were wars going on. They were fighting with the Native Americans. They were fighting with each other. And that must have been very difficult for Native Americans. If you could imagine being a very peaceful culture that tried to avoid conflict and work together with their neighbor, being taken over by this group of people who came with these weapons that you don't understand, then you would understand this site if you really stop to think about that. But let's rewind 15,000 years before any of that was even going on and talk about what made this such a great place for people to settle. The town of Northfield. So 15,000 years ago, if we had been standing on this site, we would have been standing on 1.5 miles of glacial ice. That's right, the end of the Ice Age. And more specifically, that ice would have been melting. Like I said, the end of the Ice Age. So 15,000 years ago, this ice was melting, and all of these rivers were flowing because all of this ice had been melting. And where we stand today in Northfield, it became a place for many minerals to be deposited into the soil. Clay and silt were deposited into this soil, which has left it open for many creatures to thrive here. Lots of animals, lots of trees. It's what we call biodiversity, when so many things are able to take advantage of one location. And for humans, it's a gorgeous sight, as you'll see when we hike out to Lake Hitchcock today. Perfect place to enjoy your picnic lunch. So 15,000 years ago, that was happening. And the Sukoki Abenaki actually have a legend about this event. It's one of those stories that's told through oral tradition, which the Native Americans love, and I'd love to tell it to you. So the story goes something like this. It's called Pecomtuck and the Beaver. So the beaver was a selfish creature, and it dammed up all of the water so that it could no longer flow. And by damming up all of the water so that it could no longer flow, it was able to keep all of the food to itself. It was a greedy, greedy animal. But Pecomtuck was not happy with the beaver. And so Pecomtuck punished the beaver for its selfish actions and allowed all of the waters to flow again so that everybody could enjoy the richness of this land. And everybody, all creatures, could eat what they needed to eat and live fairly and in harmony. And that's how Lake Hitchcock was formed, according to the Native American legend. It's when Pecomtuck decided to punish the very selfish beaver. So oral tradition teaches us something about Native Americans and what they value, for example. The stories always have to do with animals and finding peace and superstitions of sorts that all revolve around nature and how we observe and learn from nature and how we can observe and learn from this site. And I really want to talk about how we can learn from this site today. But before we get to that, let's fast forward a little bit into the future, but still backwards in time from today. So about 1675, the Beers Massacre. So once again, going back to that sign, the Native Americans were meeting here as a place of peace. This to them was a place to convene and talked to other tribes who had been fleeing the coast near Plymouth, Massachusetts, because King Philip was coming in with his troops and slaughtering the Native Americans and slaughtering the colonists, and everybody feared for their lives, and everybody was fleeing as far west as they could go. The Native Americans took sanctuary in where we stand today, Northfield. And so the Sukoki Abenaki, who are originally from this area, needed to form peace with the other tribes. And they did this often through intermarriage and other means. One of these means may have been these council fires. They could have all gathered here to discuss how they were going to form peace between their different groups. So while these groups were forming peace, we had King Philip's War happening. These foreigners, non-natives to the land, who came here, who caused violence, who terrified each other and the Native Americans. The colonists were not safe in Northfield. They fled even farther west than the Native Americans, leaving them to have Northfield all to themselves. Once King Philip's War was over, the colonists returned. Once again, Northfield was full of these rich, fertile soils, with all of these great mineral deposits. Perfect place for farmland. They started putting down their homes, setting up roots, creating all of these things that are important to Western world ideals. They had these huge commercial farms that they created in order to feed more immigrants who were coming through. And pretty soon, this land looked nothing like the Native Americans remembered it at all. It did not feel like the Sukoki Abenaki's homes anymore. Their footpaths had become roadways. Bigger roadways were being built, highways even. Even before cars, there were other ways of traveling that required these massive, massive roads. Fast forward even further into the 20th century and the 21st century today, you have these big roads that we all depend on, this infrastructure, which has completely, forever changed the landscape, brought invasive creatures to this land, things that were never supposed to be here. And so it has changed a great deal today. So how do we really think about the Native Americans, how they must have felt? Their lands being taken over by total strangers, being done away with forever. Their way of life, their prior way of life. Well, fast forward to today, where we will be hiking. Sergeant Ames, a man who owned this land and his family, decided to sell it to Mount Grace Land Trust. They were somewhat aware of its history, and they wanted to conserve as much of their land as possible. They owned a lot of it. So Mount Grace Land Trust took this 5-acre patch of land and knew about this historic marker and decided that the respectful thing to do would be to contact local tribe members and ask them how they would like the land used. That's the respectful thing to do if their history is here, of course. Native American tribal members responded very positively. They reached back out to Mount Grace and said, absolutely, we'd love to be a part of your project and we'd love to talk to you about how we'd like this land to be used. So Mount Grace and the Native American tribal members teamed up to build the trail we will be walking today, which is an accessible trail. However, it looks a little weird. It's raised. And the reason it's raised is because it is built according to the Native Americans' specs, if you will. So the Native Americans' specs are that you cannot dig into the ground. Normally, trails are, sunk in a little bit. You rake up the ground, you try to get it down 6 inches below that top layer. You're not allowed to do that if you're building according to Native American specs. That's not how they manage the land. So when Mount Grace was building their trail, they had to build on top of the land. They just worked with what they had. They flattened it out and they used the landscape to their advantage. And so the trail, aside from the fact that it is wheelchair accessible, is even more unique in that it's raised in the way that it is. But like I said, not actually raised. It only appears raised because we are not used to seeing trails built this way. So this project allowed for collaboration between two groups, descendants of European settlers and Native Americans today, to collaborate and possibly to mend some of their history. So as you walk and talk and learn together from all the wonderfully crafted signs that have been placed along the trail that you're going to see today, please stop and spend a few moments in silence. Take in the unique landscape, the the crisp smell of the woodland air, and let it dwell in your soul on how this collaborative project has once again restored peace to this land, as the two groups who worked together fought to overcome a history of discord and centuries of misunderstandings. I hope you enjoy your walk.